Wonder Boy. This is a weird series of games. A weird series of games I have been meaning to talk about, just to talk about how strange it really is as an experience. But I guess this can be a nice little springboard for that, so let's start with that. Wonder Boy started life out as this Sega exclusive platforming adventure that somehow ended up on the NES, but only after Hudson acquired the rights and rebranded it to feature their president as the main character. Now, I don't think too many people actually know about Wonder Boy, the original at the very least, but I'm betting a fair few of you actually are quite familiar with Meijin Takahashi no Bokenjima, or more accurately as we know it in the West, and they removed all references to this being about a real guy, Adventure Island. Well, the direct follow-up to the original Wonder Boy was a game called Wonder Boy Monster Land. This was in and of itself a very strange game because it got rebranded and remade about 1,000,000,000,000,000, squillion, trillion different ways, and some of these ways ended up kind of offshooting into their own series of sorts. You ended up with the Journey to West themed Sayuki World, which we never got because it was on the Famicom, but it got a sequel that we did get in the now Native American themed Wampum. Why? Okay, why the shift in theme there? But also, why did we not get the first one, but we got the second one? Why? What? You had a tie-in with a wafer biscuit collectible sticker series known as Bakuri Man on the PC Engine. One of these weird spin-offs and offshoots was Turma de Monaca. I'm hoping that was remotely close, but some kind of weird Brazilian Portuguese comic book. And this in and of itself got 3 sequels that were rebrandings of later versions of games in this series as well. This series is weird. I don't know if I've made that clear yet, but it really is strange. Heck, a long time later on Japanese mobile phones, the series in a weird sort of Ouroboros sort of ate itself and had a Adventure Island spin-off of this exact game about 20 years later. Why do this? I'm confused and weird. This is very strange. The series still kind of exists to this day. We have Monster Boy in the Cursed Kingdom, which came out, 5 years ago now, as well as Wonder Boy Returns, as well as, if we want to go a little bit more obscure, Clockwork Aquario, which was made by the Wonder Boy people back in, 1992, only to be released in, 2022. Did I mention this series is weird yet? And I mean, the fourth game, that was the direct inspiration for Shantae, which in and of itself still exists today. This is a weird series that exploded into a whole bunch of different things at different periods of time, and it's all fascinating to me. I have a deep love for the Wonder Boy series, and all of its many bizarre and interesting spin-offs, and how, they tree branched out into their own things, and how it's inspired so many things, and it's just fascinating to see this one point of this more or less very, very basic, kind of sort of uninspired, obscure Sega platformer kind of explode into this whole thing that's ironically probably better known for Adventure Island than anything. It's off-brand knockoff starring Hudson's president. This is such a trip of a series, and I am very, very passionate about this series, if you can't tell. I have a deep love for the Wonder Boy series, which is sad because I don't really own much of it. But fortunately, this was sent to me on the Sega Mega Drive collection on Steam, so I can check it out, and I have to say, it is pretty good. I've got some issues with it, and there's some weirdness to it, but I do quite like Wonder Boy in Monster World on the Sega Genesis, or Dynasted Hero on the PC Engine, and one of the versions of this game also stars, again, that weird Brazilian comic, Turma de Monaca, which is something I know absolutely nothing about, but I do know that this is effectively a sequel to, again, the original Wonder Boy in Monster Land now, even though it was a spin-off of that spin-off, and again, it's almost like its own completely different IP at this point. This series is weird, is the takeaway here. Also, this means I get to talk about Shantae for a minute, which makes my day. Also, she wiggles her butt when she crouches, and that always makes me giggle. But the point is that the story to this game stars Shion. You can tell he's the protagonist because he has blue hair and also no mouth, except when he gets hurt. How does he eat in this world? Does he have to, physically injure himself every time he wants to take a bite? I do not want to live in this world. That sounds horrifying. He's probably best known for being this guy right here, and that there's monsters in this world, he's got to go put a stop to that. And that's pretty much your plot. This game is very, very light on plot. Ostensibly, it's about just moving from place to place, although the greater overarching tone of this is to get the Sword of Legend to get to the final area. And to get to that, you have to get an old axe, which is actually a reference to the original Wonder Boy, and I guess Adventure Island. And then you need to get a suit of armor so that you can go into a volcano to forge it. That's sort of your overarching goal here, but everything beyond that is basically just solving local issues at the time. And like that axe, there are lots and lots of references to the previous game. The entire first level of this is a retread of the original Monsterland, which makes this sort of a weird rebranding of the original game. Sorta. But there's just lots of interesting little references to the previous iterations and the people who really stuck around through the Wonder Boy series, and I do appreciate that. For all the lack of a plot this game really has, it does have some interesting callbacks and references, and does make this series feel larger than really what it is. It does make the game feel like it has a much greater scope because it's interconnected with the older titles, and they sort of tell one giant linear cohesive story. But maybe I'm just over-attributing something that just made me smile. I don't know. The day-to-day adventuring in Monster World is relatively simple. Xion can run, he can jump, he can slash with his sword, although he can also equip a spear to stab with, although neither weapon are all that great. The spear gets a little bit more range on it, but you have to attack basically directly in front of you, which is awkward to hit with, especially when enemies kind of come at angles. His sword can swing in an arc, so it can handle the angles, but you basically have to stand in your opponents to hit them sometimes, so it's not great, especially with some of the more wonky hitboxes some of the later enemies and bosses have. You also can equip yourself with a shield, which I'm honestly not sure what the different variations of shield actually do. I know if you equip the shield, you can sometimes block damage from projectiles, provided that it hits specifically your shield and nothing else, but none of the other shields seem to be bigger or have like a bigger hitbox or anything. It might be a percentile to block. I'm not 100% sure on this. You can also equip yourself with items and magic with the 2 slots in the top right hand corner. These are handled kind of weird though, because while this game is basically a 2-button game for the most part, the A button is labeled to handle what's in those 2 slots, which again you can configure with any combination of 2 items or magics. But the thing is, you have to hold the button down and then select right or left on the D-pad in use. And I don't like that. That doesn't really work, because when you hold down the A button, your character is basically entirely immobile. And then you have to put in a secondary input. And in the time it takes to do that, you could be attacked or overwhelmed by enemies. Given that certain encounters later on have very high quantities of enemies, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, and the time it takes to put in an additional input could very well spell disaster for you. Why they didn't just give you 1 slot and have it mapped to A is beyond me, and it seems really obnoxious more than anything for that one small change. You also can equip yourself with various bits of equipment that will change the mechanics slightly. Usually a different set of boots will allow you to go through different environments, such as the desert. Typically the boots just increase your movement speed, although across the game it is intolerably slow, even if you have the fastest boots at the end of the game, which is a little unfortunate. There's a specific weapon that enables you to swim, which is absolutely necessary for a later dungeon. Unfortunately, it's a spear, and when you're underwater, enemies can come from all directions significantly more frequently than anywhere else in the game, so you have even less of a chance to hit them. It's a bit rough at times. And after every little route, before you go into a major dungeon, you'll have a town that'll have shops with new items in stock. And this is when you're going to have to grind to make the money in order to actually get that equipment, which is pretty much paramount if you want to actually survive in this game, because this game is punishing. While there are a couple of healing items, you have to buy them, and there are occasionally like a revive you can find in some of the dungeons, but they're one-use items. There's no heal spell whatsoever, and the closest thing to that you'll get is a shield spell that does basically nothing, because the shield itself is actually beyond your sword reach. So if you try and use your sword will actually damage your own shield, and you can't do anything about enemies because they'll just jump at you anyway. The only use for the shield I can imagine is using it with the spear, but the spear's already unpleasant to use as well, so it's kind of a crapshoot. Really, the only useful magic you get are the ones that increase your attack damage and just outright damage spells, and most of the enemies you'd actually want to use those damage spells on, they do very little effect, so it's not super great to use the magic in here. However, across the game you will get several different familiars to help you on your journey. You can only have one at a time, and unfortunately they are locked to the location you get them at, so they're not half as useful as they'd end up being, but they do have various effects. The first one you get is a fairy that can drop hearts to heal you, which is good because health drops in this game are low. You can get a dwarf that can destroy walls in the backgrounds to find secret rooms, as well as treasure, which is cool. You can get yourself a little tiny adorable Grim Reaper that is basically useless, although occasionally it will fling attacks out at enemies, although his detection range is spotty at the best of times. And you can get yourself a little dragon that is way more awesome than it has any right to be. The Dragon Lord just hatches a grandson for you, and it's not the most awkward or weird thing ever. This series is weird, is what I'm saying. The funny thing about this game is, well, I do think that for the most part the game works well enough. I find myself fondly remembering the between point A and point B sort of ways of getting around the environment, more so than the actual dungeons, because if I actually have to sit here and talk about the dungeons are abysmal for the most part. Like, the first dungeon, I went in, and there's a locked door. There's nothing I can do, so I went back to town and talked to someone, and they said, oh, you need an ocarina to open up that door, which I lost in that dungeon. I went back, and it was there in a place that it wasn't a moment before, but sure. Except, my character didn't know how to play the ocarina, so I had to go back and talk to the person again. It is then that they teach you 3 songs that you have to remember the exact button inputs. Side note, Ocarina of Time absolutely stole its mechanics from this, but did it way better, because that at least told you what those buttons were. This game, it dumps 3 songs on you from the start, and you're expected to remember them, and just pull them out when necessary, which, for me, just meant brute forcing it for about 15 minutes. It was not fun. The next dungeon is relatively fine. It's just, you know, find some secret doors and just kill some enemies. It works really, really well. Then you get to the water stage, and look, if you're one of those people who absolutely hates water stages, this is absolutely not going to change your mind about it, because again, you have to swim and it's slow and awful, even if you have the boots that make you swim a little faster. And you have, like I said, a spear, which means you can't even attack at angles, which frequently enemies will swim at you from. Here's where I really started noticing that the enemies were ramping up in sheer volume as well, because there are just significantly more enemies, and even though I was keeping up in terms of armor and equipment, it was just so much damage so frequently, and there was just very, very few health drops. It's a real issue in this game because enemies feature fixed drops. This is a holdover from the original arcadey Wonder Boy and Monster Land, where you couldn't farm enemies because they didn't want you standing around because you'd be wasting time, and, you know, time is quarters in an arcade machine, so instead every enemy had 1 drop. Well, in this game, every enemy does have fixed drops, and they only spawn a certain number of times until you leave the room, but every enemy's drops are pre-fixed. And for the most part, they just drop money. Very, very, very rarely do they drop any sort of health, which means that in the longer dungeons, it's incredibly frustrating. And if you die in this game, in the North American version anyway, you have to restart from your last save. In the Japanese version, you actually just go back to the inn with a little bit of money lost, and you keep all your progress at this point, so if you'd found something, you get to keep that. That's great! Not in the North American version, you just get to start over from your save. This game definitely benefits from the save state feature, especially later on, because that water dungeon is miserable. After the water dungeon, you end up going to the desert and going to a pyramid, which is actually relatively uneventful and decent enough. I actually had fun going through here. Again, aside from the fact that it felt like there needs to be a lot more health drops than what I had, and I kind of had to save scum a little bit just to get through some of the rooms, but it ends in a really genuinely interesting boss fight that can outright kill you in 1 move if you're not paying attention. Also, if you're not using a Genesis controller, this might actually be tricky because this actually is a quiz that requires you to know the actual buttons of your Genesis controller on hand, and you don't have time to look at it or anything because it's timed. Following that is going to the Land of Ice, where you go into an ice temple, and oh, they really wanted to be creative about slipping mechanics and how enemies would push you off of platforms and how you had to use momentum to try and make jumps, but they'd plop enemies right in the way that you have to hit several times before they die. Yeah, the ice level is grim and not particularly fun. And then after that, it's a volcano, which is, again, fairly uneventful aside from the fact that it needs more health drops. And then, of course, there's the Demon Lord's Castle. Not the final stage, mind you, but it's frustrating beyond all belief. The first chunk of this, like a lot of things in this game, is actually a reference to earlier Wonder Boy games. It's actually kind of a beat-for-beat retread of the original Monsterland final stage. kind of a maze where you have to, without any clues, just sort of bumble around until you stop teleporting yourself into circles. And, you know, it works relatively well enough. Unfortunately, after that, they start dropping like mini bosses on you and like terrible giant rooms that require you to blindly jump at stuff that you don't know is there and figure out rooms on the fly. And if you fail, you go back to fight those bosses, which again, you don't get healed, and there's no health drops or even health magic. So it's just miserable. And that's the weird thing about this game, because I'm still thinking about this game and I've got actually pretty fond memories of it. I had a lot of fun, but every one of these temples is just not really fun. It's just not. The first one is annoying with its ocarina mechanics. From there, it's just obnoxious use of mechanics in a way that just makes it more frustrating than enjoyable. Between the temples, it's a lot of fun, but you know, those temples themselves are, for the most part, just really unfun to play, and they drag on forever, and they just punish the player over and over just because there's no item drops. And because of how long it takes to get to some of these places, if you weren't using save states, going all the way back to inns and stuff takes forever. Like I said, this game benefits from that save state system, and I would argue it's almost imperative you use it because you will be wasting so much time just recovering from simple mistakes because of how annoying some of these dungeons are designed. I appreciate that they're trying to explore more mechanics and make them more, you know, different and interesting from one another, but the way they've done it is just make them more frustrating as time goes on. And I mean, heck, if you want to talk about fixed drops being weird, it's not until I was like 80% the way through the game that I actually ran into an enemy that drops magic so that you can actually refill your magic without going to an inn. I didn't even realize up to this point that was a thing. I just thought, you know, in between inns you only have so many uses of magic, but that's not the case. It's just fixed drops and so few of them actually do. This game would benefit from everything having the potential to drop magic or items or anything, but very rarely do they actually do that. This game is very player unfriendly at times, I will say that. And yet, in spite of how negative I've been this entire time, I'm still coming away with a smile on my face thinking about this game. It's hard to explain, but everything about this game just has a sort of like clumsy charm about it, you know? Like, everything in this game feels like it's being held together with chewing gum and hope. And it just feels like they definitely wanted to try and do something different. This game is not as ambitious as previous games. The previous game in the series, Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap, had a bunch of different monster transformations that allowed you to have completely different mechanics based on which form you had. That's pretty much missing from this game, but there are still bits of this game that want to acknowledge different forms and stuff that do kind of change how the game plays a little bit. And while every dungeon in this game is basically obnoxious, it's obnoxious because they're trying to do different things with it and try and make the game a little bit more interesting and different than just a standard jumpy, slashy, platformy thing, you know? And I think that effort really shines through into something that, even at its core, I found myself with the core content being more annoyed with than anything. I still find this pretty positive. The overall presentation to Wonder Boy in Monster World is pretty solid. Visually, I don't think it's going to blow you away for a Genesis game, but there are some really nice high points. The enemies look very, very cute and goofy, and there are bits here and there that look really cool. I think it's supposed to be snow in the ice area. They're glowing lights that fall from the sky, but I think it's supposed to be snow. I thought that was pretty noteworthy. And when you go to the fairy realm very early on, it kind of changes its art style a little bit to have sort of a more like Yoshi's Island inspired like color scheme a little bit. Like there's just something about it that completely changes the way that like the tiles are stylized, you know? It is very, very memorable for what is effectively only one room. I don't know why they put so much effort in changing the art style for one room, but I thought it looked really, really cool. I love the goofy little faces all the enemies make. The ghost that looks really, really like just sad when you kill him because he doesn't seem like he understands that he's just being annoying when you kill him. It's cute. This game has a lot of cute little animations and personality all over the place. And audio-wise, it's actually pretty good. It's a varied soundtrack to be sure. You have a lot of really chill, nice music. I like the music on the beaches and stuff. That is very calming and chill, but at other times, you see that they utilize the harshness of the Genesis sound chip in such a way that the songs themselves would fit in perfectly with like a Thunder Force game. Like seriously, there's some like really nice action jams with this game. And the Demon King's Castle is like a medley of the original Wonder Boy in Monsterland's theme songs and boss themes, which was such a cool idea. I do quite like that callback as well. It just leads to a fantastic presentation overall for this Sega Genesis Genesis game. Now, if you want a copy of Wonder Boy in Monster World, this is currently being played on the Steam Mega Drive collection, and you can get this as an individual DLC for that for like $1. But you can also buy the whole collection just as its own thing, and I believe there were physical releases for consoles as well. But those are not the only ways to play this game. Of course, there is the classic style of just get a Sega Genesis cart, but the cheapest one there on eBay is $50 because Genesis games are really going up in price right now, which I have got to work on my Genesis collection. I grew up with that thing, and I have like 15 games, of which maybe 2 are any good. So yeah, I guess I gotta get on that real quick. A CD copy of Dynastic Hero, the PC Engine version of this game, will cost almost double that, and it'll be in Japanese, so it might be a little tricky to play, especially with some of the more fiddliness this game tends to provide with, you know, the ocarina puzzles and other like little bits where you really have to listen to what people tell you. And if you want a copy of the Brazilian Portuguese Turma de Monaca on the Mega Drive, that is, oh my god, $250. And I only see one on eBay. That's, wow. And the thing is, on the PS3 and the Xbox 360, there was a Wonder Boy collection, which contained Wonder Boy in Monster Land, Wonder Boy in Monster World. Weirdly enough, did not contain the third one, which is one of the more beloved ones, as well as Monster World 4, you know, the prototype Shantae thing. That is awesome. And before that, we never got in English. There's also a Wonder Boy collection that's now out for like PS4 and stuff. So the point is, there are lots of ways to play this game now if you really have the desire to. I still think the Steam version is probably the least expensive way if you just buy it as a singular DLC for the Mega Drive collection, so to speak. But either way, there are lots of ways to still play this game today, and lots of different versions of this game, because this might also just be a weird version of the original game, which again got spun off to about a million billion jillion things. This series is weird.